All right, let's jump into this world where economics meets philosophy, normative economics and economic justice. I think our listeners who are into philosophy might be curious, like, how can these two fields that often seem like they disagree, how can they actually work together? And we're looking at some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to get into that. And with help from expert speaker, hopefully we can uncover some, insights that'll make everyone think a little bit.
Yeah, it's like, in economics, we're often dealing with what is the data, right? How do economies actually work? But then normative economics comes along and says, okay, well, what should be? What's the ideal? So it brings ethics and values into the mix to think about how economies should be structured, not just how they are.
Yeah. So instead of just looking at income inequality and being like, oh, there it is, normative economics asks, well, is that fair? And what should we do about it?
Exactly. It's applying those philosophical ideas of like fairness, rights, social well-being, and saying, okay, how do those apply to the economic world? And well, as you can imagine, there are different schools of thought on how to even approach that utilitarianism, egalitarianism, prioritarianism. They all have their own kind of principles and what they lead to if you follow them through.
So getting down to brass tacks, this source material talks about measuring inequality and poverty.
Yeah.
They use tools like inequality and poverty indices, but they're not just about the numbers, right? It's more about like how do these disparities actually affect like the well-being of society as a whole.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's not enough to just know there's a gap between rich and poor. You have to figure out, okay, is that gap morally acceptable and what does it actually mean for society? These indices, you can think of them as linked to social welfare functions, which basically means we're trying to figure out, okay, if we change the economy in some way, what impact does that have on everyone's well-being?
It gets even trickier because depending on your ethical framework, right, you might judge the same distribution of wealth totally differently. Like a utilitarian might be happy if the total pie is bigger, but someone else who's more about fairness might be like, hold on, how are we slicing this thing up?
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, the source mentions these things called the Jumani index and the Lorenz curve. Have you heard of those before?
Vaguely, yeah. Gini index rings a bell.
The Gini index basically gives you a single number for how unequal a society is. 0 would mean perfect equality, and 1 would mean total inequality, like one person has everything.
Okay, so the higher the Gini index, the more unequal things are.
Got
it.
All right.
But how did the Lorenz curve fit into all of this?
All right, imagine lining up everyone in a society from poorest to richest. The Lorenz curve basically plots out, okay, what share of the total income does each percentage of the population have? So if it were perfectly equal, it would be this straight diagonal line. But in reality, it always sags below that because, the poorest folks have a much smaller chunk of the pie.
So it visually shows you how that wealth is distributed. I think the source gave a real-world example. Right?
Yeah, they did. The U.S. Census Bureau data from back in 2006 showed that, the poorest 20% of people only had 3.7% of the total income, while the richest 5% had, 22.2%. Big difference there.
Wow, that's pretty stark. And it really highlights how, even in a developed country, you can see that the system kind of favors those at the top.
Yeah, and these measurements aren't just for describing the problem. They're important for seeing if the things we try to do actually work. Like, does a certain tax policy actually reduce inequality? Does this social program actually lift people out of poverty? They're tools for guiding us towards a more just society.
Right. It's not just theory, it's about actually making a difference. The source also gets into this debate between egalitarianism and prioritarianism, which both want to reduce inequality, but in different ways.
Yeah. So egalitarianism, think of that as wanting to divide everything equally. Everyone gets the same slice of the cake, no matter what their circumstances are.
And then prioritarianism.
Prioritarianism says, okay, let's focus on improving the lives of those who are worst off, even if it means a little less equality overall. Like if some people have to have slightly bigger slices so that the people who are starving actually get fed, that's okay.
So they both want a more just system, but their strategies might be a little different, right?
Right. And while philosophers might argue about which is better, economists tend to focus on just ranking different social states like, okay, is this distribution better than that one based on how well off people are rather than getting too caught up in the why?
So economists are more about, okay, given these different values, how do we actually make decisions? What are the practical implications?
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about welfare economics. This is basically the part of economics that tries to figure out, okay, what impact do economic policies have on individual and societal well-being?
Okay, so this is where things start to get a little bit fuzzy for me. I remember learning about old and new welfare economics way back in college, but could you remind me what the difference was?
Sure. So old welfare economics, it really relied on trying to compare how happy or satisfied different people were, which is, incredibly difficult to measure.
So new welfare economics moved away from trying to measure happiness directly.
Exactly. Economists like Hicks and Kaldor came along and said, look, we need something more objective. They came up with things like the Pareto principle, which basically says a change is only good if it makes at least one person better off, but it doesn't make anyone else worse off.
Okay, so it sounds pretty straightforward. I mean, who wouldn't want to make things better for someone without hurting anyone else? What's the catch?
The catch is that in the real world, it's almost impossible to find a policy that does that. Most changes have trade-offs. Someone wins, someone loses. So the Pareto principle ends up being too limited to be useful most of the time.
Ah, okay, so it's a nice ideal, but not very practical.
Exactly. That's why they came up with other things like the Kaldor-Hicks criterion. This one's a bit more relaxed. It says a change is good if, hypothetically, the winners could compensate the losers and still come out ahead.
So it's like, even if the losers don't actually get compensated, the change is still good as long as the potential is there. That seems a bit ethically iffy, doesn't it?
You're getting it. It really highlights this big tension in welfare economics. The tension between efficiency, which economists love, and equity, which is a huge concern in political philosophy.
Right, it's that classic struggle between wanting the biggest pie overall versus making sure it's sliced fairly.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting when we start talking about thinkers like John Harsanyi. He was all about utilitarianism, and he came up with some pretty interesting arguments to back it up.
Oh yeah, Harsanyi. I'm vaguely familiar with him. Didn't he come up with that impartial observer argument?
He did. He basically said that imagine you're making decisions for society, but you don't know which person in society you're going to be. You're behind this veil of ignorance.
Right. Kind of like that original position thing in Rawls' theory of justice.
Spot on. So Harsanyi said that if you were in that position, the most rational thing to do would be to try and maximize your expected utility. And since you have an equal chance of being anyone, that means you should try to maximize the average utility of everyone in society.
So he's basically using this idea of making decisions under uncertainty to argue for a utilitarian approach to well-being. Pretty clever. But I'm sure there are arguments against this approach, too.
Well, of course, like not all types of utilitarianism would actually measure utility in a way that lines up with what the impartial observer would do. Plus, some people argue that, well, the impartial observer, not knowing who they'll be, might be super risk averse. Like they might focus way too much on the worst off person, even if it means the average happiness is a bit lower.
So even if you agree with the whole impartial observer thing, there's still room to argue about how to actually measure and combine everyone's well-being.
Exactly. And Harsanyi also came up with this other thing, the aggregation theorem, which basically says that if a social planner wants to make decisions under risk, but still respect individual preferences, then the only way to measure social welfare is by adding up everyone's utility.
So again, trying to use a specific way of making decisions to justify utilitarianism.
You could say that, but even this theorem has had its share of criticism. Like Diamond, another economist, he challenged the whole idea that using expected utility is the right way to go about this.
Okay, what's the problem with using expected utility?
Well, he pointed out that it can lead to some weird results, like where the social planner is totally fine with a lottery where everyone has equal chances versus a situation where some people are definitely better off, but others are definitely worse off.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very fair.
Exactly. It highlights just how hard it is to define social welfare, especially when you throw in uncertainty. Even if we agree that everyone's well-being matters, how you combine all those preferences into one big measure of how good society is, that's a huge puzzle. And it actually kind of ties in with something we've talked about before, Arrow's impossibility theorem, which basically says you can't create a perfect voting system.
Right, because if you can't even get voting right, then how are you supposed to get something as complex as measuring social welfare right? This is getting pretty mind-bending.
Yeah, it is. But that's what's so cool about where economics and philosophy meet. It forces us to confront these tough questions about how we make decisions and what it means to be fair and just. So yeah, Arrow's impossibility theorem. Really fascinating idea. And it goes way beyond just economics. It pops up in political science, decision theory, philosophy, all over the place.
I remember the basics, but give me a refresher. What exactly makes a voting system, or any way of combining people's preferences, impossible, according to Arrow?
Okay, so he came up with these criteria that, ideally any fair voting system should meet. Unanimity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, and non-dictatorship. Ringing any bells?
Yeah, yeah. Unanimity. So if everybody prefers option A over option B,
Yeah.
the system should reflect that, right?
hmm
And independence of irrelevant alternatives. So if you add or remove a third option, that shouldn't change how people rank A and B.
hmm
And non-dictatorship, meaning no single person gets to call all the shots. Those all seem pretty reasonable.
Right, totally reasonable. But Arrow went and mathematically proved that you can't have all three at the same time. You always have to sacrifice at least one. So there's no such thing as this perfect system for adding up everyone's different preferences.
So no matter how hard we try, we're always going to hit some kind of roadblock, some kind of compromise.
Yeah, that's the bummer that Arrow's theorem throws at us. No magic bullet solution, unfortunately. Like, if you really prioritize unanimity and independence of irrelevant alternative, you might end up with a system that's super easy to manipulate, or one that just ignores what minorities want.
So even with the best of intentions, you have to make tough choices and accept that you can't please everyone all the time, right?
Absolutely. And that's where, the expertise of philosophers like you is so crucial. Because normative economics has to grapple with these ethical dilemmas, right?
Mhm.
Weighing different values and seeing how different choices actually play out in the real world.
Yeah, who knew a math theorem could lead to such deep ethical questions? Now, the source material mentions something called the informational basis for social choice. What is that all about?
This is where we get into, like, what information do we even need to make fair decisions? The classic way of thinking about social choice, like what Arrow did, it mostly focuses on people's rankings, like do they prefer A over B, B over C, and so on. But some argue that that's not enough.
What else is there?
Well, for starters, how strongly do they feel about it? It's one thing to slightly prefer A over B, but it's another to completely despise B, right? That could make a big difference.
Yeah, if you treat all preferences the same, no matter how much people care, you're probably going to get some weird outcomes.
Right. And some people go even further and say, look, we need to go beyond preferences altogether. We need to think about people's well-being, their resources, the opportunities they have, their capabilities. It all ties into this big equality of what's debate. What are we even trying to make equal here?
Now, that is a deep philosophical question. And that's not something economists can answer on their own, right? You need input from ethical theory and a real understanding of human values.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to fair allocation theory. This branch of economics tries to bridge the gap between these big ideas and actually figuring out how to distribute resources.
So it's going from the abstract to, like, okay, how does this play out in real life?
Exactly. One of the key ideas here is envy-freeness. Basically, it means that nobody would rather have someone else's stuff. Everyone's content with what they have, at least compared to what others have.
So no more keeping up with the Joneses. Everyone's happy with their own slice of the pie.
Yeah, something like that. And the cool thing is, you don't need to compare how happy people are to figure this out. You just need to know their rankings. Do they prefer this bundle of goods over that one?
So no need to get into the whole mess of measuring happiness.
Exactly. A classic example is something called a competitive equilibrium with equal shares. Basically, imagine everyone starts with the same amount of money and they can trade freely in a market where everyone's competing fairly.
So you get the efficiency of the market, but with a fair starting point. Sounds pretty good, but does that ever actually happen in the real world?
Well, that's where things get more complicated, because even though envy-freeness is a nice goal, it might clash with other things, like efficiency or solidarity. Let's go back to that example of new technology that might benefit some but harm others.
Ah, so even if the new technology eventually makes everyone better off, the way it's rolled out could create winners and losers, which could lead to, well, envy.
Exactly. And that gets at the heart of the conflict between efficiency and fairness. If you try too hard to make sure nobody's envious, you might actually slow down progress or prevent innovation.
So yet another trade-off. Are there other ways of thinking about fair allocation that try to deal with these trade-offs?
There are. One interesting thing the source brings up is that even the idea of envy-freeness itself can be kind of broken down into different parts, and sometimes those parts clash with each other.
Wait, I thought envy-freeness was pretty simple. Nobody wants what someone else has. How is that complicated?
Well, it gets tricky when you start thinking about things like, what if people have different talents or different needs? Then you run into this tension between the idea of compensation and the idea of reward.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the compensation principle that says people with the same preferences should end up with basically the same things, even if they have different talents or disabilities. Like, you shouldn't be worse off just because of something you can't control.
Yeah, that makes sense. You shouldn't be punished for things you can't help.
But then there's the reward principle, which says that people with the same talents or abilities shouldn't envy each other. So basically, you should be rewarded based on your effort and your contribution, not just what you happen to prefer.
Right, so this encourages people to, like, work hard and contribute to society. But I can see those two might clash, yeah.
Exactly. Like, imagine someone super talented who just doesn't like to work that much. Should they still be compensated based on what they could produce? Or should they only get rewarded for the effort they actually put in, even if that means they end up with less than someone less talented but more hardworking?
Ooh, that is a tough one. That really gets to the heart of, like, responsibility and what we value as a society.
And that's exactly why this mix of economics and philosophy is so interesting and challenging. You can't really talk about economic systems without wrestling with these big questions about justice and fairness.
I'm starting to think I need to go back to philosophy school. But seriously, this is super insightful stuff. Are there other concepts in fair allocation theory we should explore?
Yeah, so much to think about with envy-freeness. But what other angles does fair allocation theory offer?
Oh, there are a couple more really interesting things we could talk about. Solidarity principles and welfare bounds. They kind of offer different ways to think about fairness, beyond just whether someone envies someone else.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about solidarity principles.
Okay, so solidarity principles, they emphasize this idea that, people in a society, they should share both the good and the bad that comes from how things are structured. Like a sense of, hey, we're in this together, shared fate, mutual responsibility.
I love that. So if there's like a sudden abundance of resources or some amazing new technology comes along, everyone should benefit, right?
That's the idea. Everyone gets to share in the good times.
But what about when things go south? Well, that's where the sharing the burdens part comes in. If there's, say, a natural disaster or the economy tanks, the idea is that the burdens should be shared fairly, too.
We're all in this together, applied to economics. Really powerful concept. But how does this relate to envy-freeness? They seem pretty different.
They are, and sometimes they can even be at odds. Remember that example we talked about? A new technology that helps some people but hurts others? Well, if you're really strict about envy-freeness, you might not want to implement that change, even if it ultimately makes society better overall. But with solidarity principles, you might say, hey, if everyone's ultimately better off, even if some have to go through some temporary bumps, let's do it.
So solidarity is more about the overall good, the big picture, even if some individuals might feel a little disadvantaged in the short run. It's a different way of framing fairness,
Yeah.
right? Less about individual comparisons, more about shared outcomes.
Exactly. Okay, now on to welfare bounds. Think of these as like a safety net. They guarantee some minimum level of well-being for everyone, no matter where they are in the economic pecking order.
So no matter what, nobody falls below a certain level, even if that means accepting a bit of inequality overall. Kind of a compromise between strict equality and allowing for some variation based on, effort, talent, things like that.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, right? Making sure everyone has at least the basics, but still allowing for some differences based on, like you said, effort, contribution, things like that.
This fair allocation theory, it really gives you this framework for thinking about different ways to implement economic justice.
Yeah.
It's not just one answer. It's about weighing different values and trade-offs.
Yeah, it's a whole toolbox of ideas. And we've really just scratched the surface. There are so many models and approaches out there for all sorts of specific economic issues. Like, how do you distribute public goods fairly? Or allocate things that can't be divided? Or design a tax system that's more equitable?
This is definitely making me want to learn more about this stuff. But before we move on, I'm curious, what do you find most interesting about this whole area where economics and philosophy meet?
You know, what really blows my mind is that even though normative economics gives us all these tools to analyze economic systems and evaluate them, it can't really answer those big should questions on its own. It needs philosophy to define what justice actually is, what fairness means, what constitutes well-being. It's a real partnership.
Yeah, you need the economic tools and the ethical compass to really navigate all this. Now, I know the source material touched on a few more things, ideas that kind of push beyond traditional economic thinking. Can we get into that a bit?
Absolutely. Let's broaden our horizons a bit and think about how things like freedom, capabilities, and even happiness play into this whole idea of a just and equitable society.
Okay, freedom seems like a natural place to start. I mean, economic freedom is a big deal in a lot of political philosophies, but I'm guessing incorporating it into economics is, well, not straightforward.
Yeah, for sure. One big challenge is like, how do you even define freedom? Is it just about having the legal right to do something, or is it about actually having the means to exercise that right?
Right, so you might technically have the freedom to vote, but if you're struggling with poverty or discrimination or lack of education, your actual ability to exercise that freedom is limited.
Exactly. And normative economics needs to take both kinds of freedom into account. It's not enough to just say, hey, you have the right to do this. You have to create conditions where people can actually take advantage of those rights, level the playing field a bit.
Makes sense. But how do you measure something like freedom so you can actually use it in economic models and policy evaluations?
One way is to look at the range of choices people have. The more choices, the more freedom, generally speaking. But it's not just about how many choices, it's about the quality, the diversity of those choices.
So having 1,000 kinds of sugary cereal to choose from isn't as good as having a few healthy and affordable options.
Yeah. And to make it even trickier, what a good choice is can be totally subjective, right? What feels freeing to one person might feel limiting to another.
Okay, so finding one way to measure freedom that works for everyone, that seems pretty tough.
It is. No easy answers there. But that doesn't mean we should ignore it. It just means we need to be, thoughtful about how we approach it.
Well said. Now, what about capabilities? That was another thing you mentioned.
The capability approach, this was developed by Amartya Sen, and it kind of shifts the focus away from just resources and more towards what people can actually do and be. It's about human agency, the ability to live a life that you have good reason to value.
So instead of just looking at how much money someone has, you look at what they can actually achieve with that
Yeah,
money, right?
yeah.
What are they capable of?
Exactly. Capabilities include basic things like, health, nutrition, shelter, but it also includes more complex things like participating in your community, being able to express your views, having access to education and healthcare.
It's a much richer way to think about well-being than just focusing on material stuff.
For sure. The capability approach recognizes that resources are only good if they help you actually do stuff you care about to live a meaningful life. Two people with the same income might have totally different capabilities. If one of them faces discrimination or doesn't have access to basic services.
It's about creating a society where everyone has the chance to live a life that's meaningful to them to reach their full potential. I really like that.
And the capability approach has been super influential, especially in areas like development, economics, and human rights. It's changing how we evaluate things, moving away from just looking at economic growth to looking at how people actually experiencing their lives.
This is all so fascinating. I'm really seeing how interconnected economics and philosophy are, and how crucial it is to think about both if we want to create a more just world.
Totally agree. Now, for our last stop on this tour, let's talk about happiness.
Oh, happiness economics. I know that's a whole field now, but can you really measure something as subjective as happiness? I've always wondered about that.
It's a fair question, and it's one that researchers in this field are grappling with all the time. But there's growing evidence that, yeah, happiness or subjective well-being can be measured pretty reliably. They use surveys, psychological assessments, even brain studies, all sorts of stuff.
So it's not just asking people, rate your happiness on a scale of 1 to 10.
Nope, much more sophisticated than that. They look at different aspects of happiness, like life satisfaction, positive and negative emotions, whether people feel like their lives have meaning and purpose.
That's really interesting. But even if you can measure happiness, what does that tell us about how to structure the economy or design policies?
Ah, the million-dollar question. There's a lot of debate about this. Some people think happiness should be the goal of economic policy. Like utilitarians want to maximize utility. These folks want to maximize happiness.
So utilitarianism 2.0, but using these fancier tools to measure well-being.
You could say that. But of course, not everyone's on board. Some people worry that if you focus too much on happiness, you might forget about other important things like freedom, justice, individual rights. They worry that happiness is too subjective, too easy to manipulate. Like you can imagine a society where people are conditioned to be happy, even if they're living under oppression.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Happiness on its own doesn't seem like a complete moral guide.
Right, and that's exactly why this conversation between economics and philosophy is so important. You need to think about happiness alongside other values, be critical about what real well-being means, and be careful not to fall for easy answers.
It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
using what we know about happiness, but not losing sight of those ethical principles that should be guiding us.
Absolutely. The goal is to build a society where people aren't just materially well off, but where they have the freedom, the opportunities, the support they need to truly thrive.
Wow. This has been an amazing conversation. We've covered so much from the basics of normative economics to these really big ideas about freedom, capabilities, happiness. Striving for economic justice, it's not a simple thing, is it?
It's not. It's a complex, multifaceted challenge.
Yeah, but it's so important to keep thinking about it, keep pushing for a better world. I'm feeling inspired to keep learning more about all of this. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I would say keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, keep listening to different viewpoints. This whole quest for economic justice, it's not just some abstract idea, it's a call to action. It's about actually going out there and trying to make a difference.
That's a beautiful message to end on. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of normative economics and economic justice. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those hearts open.